What if your 10-year-old son was reported as a security threat just for loving airplanes? What if the man who tried to clip his wings ended up crashing his own career? This story isn't just about bias. It's about a mother who refused to stay quiet, a boy who kept his dream alive, and a system that finally got called to the runway. Jalen Morrow had a quiet way about him. Not the kind of quiet that meant shy or scared, but the kind that made you feel like his mind was always somewhere else, usually above the clouds. He was 10, small for his age, with wide-set eyes that always seemed to be tracking something invisible. In his room, there were no posters of basketball players or comic book heroes. Instead, the walls were lined with tacked-up diagrams of aircraft wings and airport layouts he'd copied from books. Model planes hung from the ceiling, suspended by fishing line, frozen mid-flight like they were waiting for permission to land. His mother, Naomi, noticed the shift before anyone else. Jalen had always been a curious kid, asking questions about everything from how weather affected altitude to what made jet engines roar the way they did. But lately that curiosity had dulled a bit. He wasn't talking about planes as much, wasn't drawing cockpit panels on the backs of napkins like he used to. She tried asking him directly one night over dinner. "Everything okay at school?" Jalen shrugged, poking at his mac and cheese. "Yeah, it's fine." Naomi didn't push. She'd learned that with Jalen, silence was often where the truth lived, and that truth came out not in words, but in the way he shut his sketchbook faster than usual when she walked in, or how he avoided eye contact whenever she mentioned anything related to flying. She found out what had happened a few days later. His teacher sent home a note about an incident in science class. Jalen had gotten too excited during a discussion about air pressure and started explaining how Bernoulli's principle worked on airplane wings. One of the other kids mimicked him, called him Captain Know-It-All, and the whole room laughed. He hadn't spoken up in class since. That night, Naomi sat on the edge of his bed, watching him stare at the ceiling. "Remember when I told you I used to watch planes take off from the park near our old apartment?" she said. Jalen nodded, but didn't say anything. "Well," she continued, "how about we do something different this Saturday? I want to show you the real thing, not from a book." From the glass, Jalen finally turned his head. "The airport?" she smiled. "The observation deck at Delacroix. We'll pack some snacks. You bring your notebook." He didn't say anything for a few seconds, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Naomi turned off the light and closed the door behind her. What she didn't say, but felt deep in her chest, was that this wasn't just a weekend trip. It was her way of telling him that no matter how loud the world laughed, his dreams were worth protecting. The air inside Delacroix International was a mix of cold metal, warm coffee, and the kind of hustle that never quite paused. Even on a Saturday morning, the place buzzed with motion. Families rolling suitcases, flight attendants weaving through crowds, business travelers already tapping at laptops. Jalen clutched his notebook close to his chest as they rode the escalator to the observation deck. Naomi walked beside him, scanning signs like she hadn't already memorized every corner of this airport in her career. When they reached the glass-walled room at the top, Jalen's eyes lit up, not dramatically, but in the way Naomi recognized as joy, quiet joy, the kind that didn't need words. He walked straight to the edge, leaned forward just slightly, and pulled out his pen. The notebook opened to a fresh page, and almost instantly he began jotting down notes. Aircraft type, airline name, gate number, noise level on takeoff. Naomi sat back on a bench, sipping her coffee and watching her son work. A couple sitting nearby noticed him too. The way he squinted through his small binoculars, the way he wrote without looking away from the runway. "He's into planes, huh?" the man asked with a chuckle. Naomi smiled. "Has been since he was 4. He could tell you the thrust rating on a 777 engine before he could tie his shoes." Jalen didn't even hear the conversation. He was too focused on a sleek silver jet taxiing into position. "That's a 737 MAX, he muttered, mostly to himself. Tailfin markings match Skyreach Airlines. A few rows up, someone else was watching too, but not with the same warmth. Captain Warren Lasky had just ended his flight rotation and was walking past the deck when he spotted Jalen. He paused. There was something about the boy that made him hesitate, not in admiration, but in suspicion. A kid, young, alone-looking, intensely focused, watching gates, scribbling notes, eyeing aircraft movements like a junior analyst. The notebook, the binoculars, the proximity to the gate numbers. Lasky didn't approach. He didn't even change expression. He simply stepped away from the glass, pulled out his comm unit, and said quietly, "This is Captain Lasky. I've got a potential concern near the north observation deck. Young male, possibly tracking aircraft behavior. Might want someone to take a look." Less than 5 minutes later, Naomi noticed two uniformed airport security officers approaching from the far side of the deck. One of them looked directly at Jalen. "Ma'am," he said to Naomi, "we received a report about some suspicious behavior. Mind if we ask your son a few questions?" Naomi blinked. "Suspicious behavior? He's sitting here with a notebook." The second officer gestured toward Jalen's writing. "That's the concern, ma'am. It's detailed. Flight info, terminal locations." Jalen looked up, confused. "I was just taking notes." Naomi stood slowly, her voice low but firm. "And who exactly decided that was something to be concerned about?" Neither officer answered, but as Naomi glanced past them, her eyes met those of the man standing just beyond the exit doors, Captain Lasky. He didn't say a word, just gave her the faintest nod. Then he turned and walked away. Jalen clutched his notebook tighter. His hand trembled, but he didn't say a word. And for the first time since arriving, he stopped watching the sky. Jalen sat frozen on the bench, his notebook still open in his lap but untouched. His pen had rolled to the ground, but he didn't move to pick it up. His heart was pounding, not the kind of pounding that comes from excitement or even fear, but the kind that makes your ribs feel too small to hold everything inside. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The way she looked at the two security officers said more than shouting ever could. "You're telling me someone saw a child writing in a notebook," she said calmly, "and thought the best response was to call airport security?" One of the officers shifted awkwardly, glancing toward his partner, then back at Naomi. "Ma'am, the report came from a flight captain. He said the boy was observing gate patterns, taking notes on aircraft types, terminal numbers." Naomi cut in. "Because he loves airplanes." Jalen still hadn't said a word. His shoulders were hunched, like he was trying to fold into himself and disappear. Naomi knelt down beside him and gently took his hand. It was clammy, his fingers stiff. "You okay, baby?" she asked, brushing a thumb over his knuckles. He didn't look at her. "Did I do something wrong?" That sentence, so soft, so unsure, punched through her like wind against a cracked windshield. Naomi stood up slowly, facing the officers again. "You have his name?" The captain?" one asked, flipping open a small notepad. "Captain Warren Lasky, Skyreach Airlines." Naomi nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Tell Captain Lasky," she said, "he's just insulted the wrong mother." They didn't stop her as she took Jalen by the hand and walked away, down the hallway toward the main atrium. But behind her, one of the officers called out softly, not quite apologetic but not indifferent either. "We're just doing our jobs, ma'am." Naomi didn't even turn around. "Then maybe it's time someone rewrites the job description." Talia Brooks hadn't planned on being in the terminal that long. Her flight had landed early, and she'd popped into Wing and Bean, the cafe across from the Skyreach crew room, for a much-needed caffeine fix. She was halfway through a lukewarm cappuccino when she noticed the tension outside the window. Two officers, a woman standing stiff as a pillar, a boy sitting on a bench, too still to be comfortable. Something about it grabbed her. Maybe it was the way the boy's body was curled inward, or the expression on the woman's face, the kind of quiet fury Talia had learned to recognize, the kind she'd worn herself once. She got up, tossed her cup, and walked toward the scene, heels clicking gently against the floor. As she drew closer, she recognized Naomi immediately, not by name, but by presence. This woman wasn't just a mom in yoga pants. There was weight in the way she carried herself. "Is everything all right here?" Talia asked, addressing the officers, but keeping her eyes on Naomi and the boy. Naomi turned, her gaze meeting Talia's with surprise that quickly gave way to something softer, relief maybe. "An ally." The shorter officer answered. "There was a report. We had to check it out." Talia crouched slightly in front of Jalen, her voice gentle. Hey there. What's your name? Jalen, he mumbled. You like planes, Jalen? She asked, nodding toward the notebook still open in his lap. He hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Talia smiled. Me too. Been flying for 15 years. First time I saw the inside of a cockpit, I thought I'd seen magic. She turned toward the officers, her tone shifting. Not confrontational, but firm. You got a kid here doing what we should be encouraging. Learning, watching, taking notes. And somebody thought that was suspicious? Again, silence. Naomi stepped forward. Captain Lasky, that's who reported it. Talia blinked. Warren Lasky? Skyreach? Naomi nodded. Talia's jaw tightened just slightly. She stood up straighter. Then I'm not surprised. That earned a confused look from both officers. But Naomi caught the undercurrent. You know him, Talia exhaled, running a hand over her braided bun. Let's just say we've crossed paths. He's the kind of pilot who talks about professional standards, but means something else when the cockpit doors closed. One of the officers started to speak, but Naomi cut in. We're done here. She turned to Jalen. Ready to go, sweetheart? He nodded. Talia leaned in close and said, You didn't do anything wrong. Don't ever let anyone convince you that being curious is dangerous. As they walked away, Talia stayed behind a moment, watching, thinking. Upstairs beyond the mezzanine, a familiar figure stood partially hidden behind a column. Captain Lasky. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were focused, calculating. Talia didn't wave, didn't nod, but she met his gaze and held it. And in that split-second exchange, everything unspoken between them crackled to life again. Captain Warren Lasky wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself. In the cockpit, that trait had served him well. Outside of it, well, he didn't much care. He believed in gut instinct, trusted his judgment, and had flown long enough to convince himself he was usually right. So when he spotted that kid at the observation deck, the one scribbling like a junior flight controller, his internal radar had started pinging. The truth was, he didn't know what the boy was up to. But the sight of him, alone, intensely focused, with skin darker than most kids Warren had seen at that deck, rubbed at something beneath the surface. He called it vigilance. Others might have called it something else. Now, standing in the crew corridor, he was expecting that would be the end of it. A minor inquiry, a quiet check, back to business. But then he saw her, Naomi, coming toward him with a steady stride that didn't slow even when she locked eyes with him. You're Captain Lasky? She asked flatly. He gave her a professional smile, the kind that looked polite but didn't reach his eyes. Yes, I am. Is there something I can help you with? Naomi stopped just short of him, standing squarely. You filed a report about a child on the observation deck. That child is my son. Warren raised a brow, still composed. Ma'am, I didn't mean anything personal. It was just a precaution. You can't be too careful these days. Kids get coached to look harmless, you know. Naomi's nostrils flared slightly. She took a breath, reining in 1,000 things she wanted to say at once. Instead, she spoke slowly. Let me be clear. My son was doing nothing more than watching planes and taking notes, because he loves aviation. That's not suspicious. That's a child with a dream. He shrugged. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply made an observation. You'd rather I ignore a gut feeling? No, Naomi said. I'd rather your gut didn't confuse passion with danger, especially when it wears a black face. That landed harder than Warren expected. He didn't respond right away. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. You saw a boy enjoying himself, she continued, and you assumed something sinister. You didn't ask him a question. You didn't approach me. You went straight to security. That wasn't about safety. That was about bias. Warren's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. You don't know me, lady. Naomi's voice dropped a note. Oh, but I do. I know men like you very well. Without another word, she reached into her bag and pulled out her ID, an official NAAR credential. His eyes darted down, and for the first time since they'd started talking, his composure cracked. She let him read it, let it register. You just profiled the son of a regional oversight director for the National Aviation Authority, she said calmly. Congratulations. Warren blinked. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, Maybe an apology, maybe another excuse. But nothing came out. Naomi didn't wait. She turned and walked away, her heels echoing down the polished floor. Warren stayed where he was, hands at his sides, unsure whether to chase after her or pretend it never happened. But deep down, something had shifted. And for the first time in years, Captain Warren Lasky had no idea what his next move should be. Naomi barely spoke on the drive home. Jalen sat in the back seat, his notebook still clutched in his hands. It hadn't left his grasp since they left the airport. Not because he was writing, he wasn't. He just held it, like if he let go, everything would spill out and disappear. When they pulled into the driveway, he followed her inside without a word. It wasn't until she started making tea that he finally broke the silence. "Are you mad at me?" he asked. Naomi turned slowly from the stove. "Why would I be mad at you?" "Because I made people think I was doing something wrong." Naomi exhaled through her nose, walked over, and knelt beside him at the kitchen table. She placed her hands gently on his shoulders. "You didn't make anyone think anything, Jalen." That man saw what he wanted to see. It had nothing to do with you. It was about his fear, not your actions. Jalen looked down. "But I didn't mean to scare anyone." Naomi's voice cracked. "You didn't. You shouldn't have to carry that. Ever." There was a pause before she stood up, walked into her office, and returned with her laptop. She opened it, logged in, and pulled up a secure internal portal, the NAAR reporting system. She clicked File New Incident. Jalen watched her for a while, then finally asked, "Are you going to get in trouble?" She glanced at him. "Maybe," he frowned. "Then why do it?" Naomi's fingers paused over the keyboard. She looked at her son for a long moment, then said, "Because if I don't, he'll do it to someone else's kid. And next time, there might not be a mom nearby." Jalen didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. Naomi returned to typing, her jaw set, eyes sharp. Meanwhile, across town, Warren Lasky was staring at his phone, reading the email he'd just received. The subject line was simple: formal review notice, incident report, pending investigation. He dropped the phone on the table with a dull clunk, then ran a hand through his thinning hair. For the first time in a long time, Warren didn't feel like the one in control. As he stood and walked toward the window, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. Tired, older than he remembered, and for the first time in years, unsure of what would come next. Sunday mornings were usually quiet in the Morrow household. Slow jazz on the kitchen radio, the smell of toast, the clink of mugs. But this one started differently. The air felt heavier. Still, like the house itself was waiting for someone to say the thing no one wanted to say. Jalen sat at the breakfast table, fingers running along the edge of his notebook like he was tracing an invisible map. His eggs were getting cold. Naomi watched him from the kitchen counter, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, the other resting flat on a newspaper neither of them had asked for. The headline caught her eye the moment she stepped outside to get the mail. "Child of NAIR official questioned at airport. Security lapse or overreaction?" Jalen hadn't seen it yet, but he would. That much Naomi knew. It was already spreading online. A blurry photo from the observation deck, a grainy shot of Jalen's notebook, and under it, a quote from an unnamed source calling the child's behavior unusual for someone that age. She folded the paper in half and tucked it under her arm. When Jalen finally looked up, his eyes were tired. Not like he'd lost sleep, but like something inside him had been working overtime, trying to process a feeling that didn't have a name. "Am I going to be on the news?" he asked. Naomi sat down across from him. "Maybe, but not for anything bad." He looked unconvinced. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, "but it still feels like I did." Naomi reached across the table, took his hand. "That's how shame works," she said gently. "It sneaks in through the back door, even when you've locked all the windows." There was a beat of silence. Then Jalen asked the question she'd been dreading. "Should I stop? With the planes, I mean." She let go of his hand and stood, walking slowly to the window. Outside, the wind shifted a branch on the old elm tree in their front yard. Its leaves trembled, but the trunk stood firm. "No," she said, turning back to him, "but you might need to get stronger. Not quieter, not smaller, stronger." He didn't respond, but something flickered in his expression. Not relief exactly, something steadier, like the ground under his feet had stopped tilting, just a little. Later that afternoon, Talia called. "You saw the piece?" she asked. "Saw it," Naomi replied, "and I'm not surprised." "There's more coming," Talia said. "I just got an email. A journalist wants to talk. Says they've received tips about Warren Lasky." Naomi straightened. "What kind of tips?" "Things from the past. Complaints that were never filed officially. Some crew members are finally speaking up." Naomi paused, absorbing the weight of it. "He's not going to go quietly." "I know," Talia said, "but I've been quiet long enough." The next day, Naomi brought Jalen back to the airport. Not for another confrontation, not even for closure. She brought him because sometimes the only way to reclaim something is to walk back into the place it was taken from. This time they entered through a different terminal, one not open to the public. Talia met them at a side entrance, flashing her ID and guiding them through the back corridors used by staff and crew. "You good?" she asked Jalen as they passed a row of vending machines and crew lockers. He nodded. "Yeah, I think so." Talia smiled. "We're going to fix that 'I think' part." She led them to a small room with a flight simulator. Nothing fancy, just a desktop setup with real controls and screens that mimicked a cockpit's view. Jalen's eyes widened as he stepped inside. "This is where we start," Talia said. Jalen sat down slowly, resting his hands on the controls like they were glass. "See that switch?" Talia pointed. "That's your master power. Flip that first." As he followed her instructions, Naomi stepped back and watched. Her son's posture changed. His shoulders relaxed, his spine straightened. The fear that had followed him like a shadow seemed to retreat, inch by inch. Later, while Jalen practiced taxiing down a virtual runway, Naomi pulled Talia aside. "You sure you want to be in the middle of this?" she asked. Talia gave a half laugh. "I've been in the middle. I just finally decided to say something." Naomi nodded. "They're already trying to sideline me. PR department suggested I take a step back for optics." "You gonna listen?" Naomi looked at Jalen, focused and calm behind the mock control panel. "No," she said. "I'm gonna step forward." That night after dinner, Jalen handed Naomi a folded sheet of paper. "I wrote something," he said. She unfolded it. At the top he'd written, "Application Essay, Georgia STEM Youth Flight Program." She read quietly, "My name is Jalen Morrow, and I want to become a pilot not just because I love planes, but because I want to make skies feel safe for kids who look like me. I don't think dreams should feel dangerous." When she looked up, he asked, "Do you think it's good enough?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She walked over, kissed the top of his head, then whispered, "It's more than good enough. It's brave." Outside the window, a distant plane blinked across the sky. Jalen watched it for a long moment, then whispered, almost to himself, "Next time, I'll be up there." Naomi wasn't used to feeling watched, at least not like this. In her years working with NAR, she'd earned her reputation by keeping her head down, doing the hard work, and letting her results speak for her. But now, every time she walked through headquarters, she felt it. The glances, the pauses in hallway conversations, the subtle shift in tone when people said her name like it came with an asterisk. She was no longer just Naomi Morrow, Regional Director. She was that mother from the news, the woman who'd gone public with a story the industry would rather leave behind closed doors. And now her inbox was full of reminders that not everyone appreciated the attention. She sat at her desk rereading the email for the third time. It came from the Deputy Director of Communications, worded politely but sharp underneath. "We strongly recommend you limit public commentary moving forward, given the pending internal review. Your cooperation will be viewed favorably." Naomi closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. Across the room, a framed photo of Jalen as a toddler, chubby cheeks, arms raised like wings, stared back at her. She'd told herself this was about protecting him, about standing up for him, but it was bigger than that now. It had to be. That afternoon, Talia showed up at her office unannounced. "I have something," she said, not even sitting down. "A message. Anonymous, but real." Naomi raised an eyebrow. Talia pulled out her phone and played the recording. It was grainy but unmistakable. Warren Lasky's voice caught during a post-flight crew briefing from years earlier. I don't trust new hires straight off the street, especially the ones who tick the diversity box. Give me old school, military trained, pale, and predictable. Naomi stared at the phone, stunned. That was sent to me by someone who used to work as root, Talia said. She said there's more. Email chains, other recordings. It was all swept under the rug. Naomi felt the weight of the moment pressed down. This wasn't just about Jalen anymore. It wasn't even just about Lasky. It was about the rot buried beneath years of silence. 2 days later, Naomi stood outside the glass doors of a downtown media studio, heart thudding against her ribs like it was trying to break free. The invitation had come quickly after word got out about the leaked audio. A national evening program. Prime time. The host promised a respectful interview. No gotcha questions, just her story in her own words. Inside, a makeup artist dabbed her cheeks. A producer fitted her mic, and Naomi sat still, thinking about all the things she hadn't planned to say, but needed to. She thought of Jalen's quiet fear, his brave essay, of Talia's shaking voice when she played that recording, of every young face she'd seen in flight school brochures, bright-eyed but mostly white, and then the red light blinked on. The host greeted her warmly, made a little small talk, and then leaned in. Naomi, what made you speak out? She looked at the camera for a beat. Her throat tightened, but her voice came clear. I didn't plan to. I just watched my son go from inspired to scared in 10 minutes flat, because someone decided he didn't look like he belonged near planes. She paused. And the truth is that someone wasn't the problem. The problem is the system that made him feel justified in calling it in. The host nodded. And the reaction since? Naomi gave a half smile. Mixed. Some people want me quiet. Others want me louder. I'm trying to be useful. That clip was shared over 2 million times in 24 hours. Back at home, Jalen watched the interview alone in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor like he used to when watching cartoons. When it ended, he didn't move right away. Instead, he got up, went to his room, opened his notebook, and turned to a fresh page. This time, he didn't write engine types or gate numbers. He wrote a letter. Dear Captain Lasky, you don't know me, but you changed the way I see the sky. I thought I had to choose between loving planes and being safe. I don't believe that anymore. He tore the page out carefully, folded it, and placed it in the center of his desk. Outside, the night was quiet, but in Jalen's chest, something had shifted, like he'd just passed through turbulence and come out stronger on the other side. The boardroom at NAR headquarters wasn't designed to feel intimidating, but it did. The chairs were too stiff, the lighting too bright, and the silence too loaded. Naomi sat at the long oak table, her ID badge clipped neatly to her blazer, a notepad in front of her. She hadn't written anything on it. Across from her sat 7 people, familiar faces mostly, colleagues, supervisors, at least 2 who'd sent her polite emails just last month. Now their expressions were carefully neutral, their voices clipped and professional. We appreciate your time today, one of them began. This is a closed-door session. We're here to discuss the ongoing review, recent media attention, and the internal impact. Naomi nodded once. She didn't smile. The man continued, It's the opinion of this board that your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, have created division within the organization. Public trust has been challenged. We'd like to offer you a way forward, one that preserves your role and protects the integrity of NAR. He slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a drafted statement, carefully worded, measured, neutral. It apologized for the misunderstanding at the airport. It acknowledged that personal involvement can blur the lines of objectivity. It expressed faith in NOIR's commitment to equity and internal review. Naomi didn't touch it. You want me to say I was wrong, she said quietly. No, someone else interjected. We want to move forward, together. With unity, Naomi leaned back. She wasn't angry, not in the way they expected. What she felt was deeper, a slow, steady burn that had been growing since that day at the observation deck. I won't sign it. Silence. The chairman blinked. Naomi, you asked me here to choose between my job and my voice, she said, and I'm choosing my voice. She stood, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape. I joined this agency to protect the skies, not to protect silence. And then she walked out, heels tapping with a clarity none of them could ignore. Later that afternoon, Naomi sat in her car outside Jalen's school. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving, long after the engine shut off. She wasn't sure if what she did today would cost her career, but somehow that didn't scare her as much as it used to. Her phone buzzed beside her, a message from Talia. "It's happening. A journalist from the Register just published the first full piece. They named Lasky. They linked the audio. It's all out." Naomi stared at the screen, then tapped once, opening the article. It was titled, "Flight Risk: How Bias and Silence Almost Grounded a Generation." Below that, in smaller print, a former flight attendant and a federal official speak out about the culture of fear inside aviation. She scrolled through the piece. Names, quotes, records. Nothing sensationalized, just facts. Laid bare. And there, toward the end, was Jalen, not by full name, but the story was unmistakable. A boy, a notebook, a false report, and a mother who didn't back down. Across town, Warren Lasky sat at his kitchen table, staring at the same article on his tablet, his hands clenched and unclenched. On the screen, his name appeared more times than he could count. He scrolled to the part about the leaked recording, his own voice immortalized now in pixels and playback. Military-trained, pale, and predictable. He remembered saying it, the exact day, the crew members in the room. He also remembered the way they looked at him afterward. Some laughed, others looked away. But no one said anything, until now. His phone buzzed, a call from his union representative. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, moved to the sink, and ran cold water over his hands. They were shaking. He hadn't even noticed. For the first time, Warren Lasky realized he might not be the one flying the plane anymore. Back in her car, Naomi looked up and saw Jalen walking out of the school building. He spotted her and smiled. Just a little, but enough. The kind of smile that came from knowing something had shifted. She stepped out, met him halfway, and placed a hand gently on his back. "Ready to go?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "But can we drive by the airport on the way home?" She blinked, surprised. "You sure?" Jalen nodded. "I want to see the planes again." Naomi smiled, her eyes suddenly damp. "Let's go," she said. "You lead." The hearing room at NAR wasn't designed for this kind of reckoning. It was built for policy talk, for procedural meetings, for dull quarterly updates. But today it felt like a courtroom, though no one wore a robe and no gavel would fall. Naomi sat at the long table, back straight, chin level. She wasn't alone. To her right was Talia, wearing her old Skyreach badge like a quiet declaration. And beside them were 3 former employees, technicians, flight crew, who had come forward after the article broke. Across from them, a panel of 5 board members looked tense, caught between 2 storms, public outcry and internal resistance. And at the end of the room, flanked by legal counsel, sat Warren Lasky. He looked smaller than before, not physically, but diminished, like the title on his badge no longer carried weight. His tie was too tight, his jaw clenched just a little too long between questions. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "We're here to review the pattern of conduct presented in recent testimonies and media reports. Captain Lasky, you may respond." Lasky leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice was even, but thin. "I've served this industry for over 30 years. I've trained younger pilots, volunteered for safety programs, upheld standards. These accusations, taken out of context, paint a picture that doesn't match my record." Naomi didn't flinch. "No one is questioning your flight hours. We're questioning your judgment, the choices you made when no one was watching." Lasky turned toward her. His gaze was sharp, but it lacked the bite it once had. "I acted on instinct. I saw a kid acting strangely. I flagged it. That's what we're taught to do." Jalen's voice came from the back of the room. "I was writing down plane numbers." Heads turned. Jalen stepped forward, nervous, but steady. He'd insisted on coming, even though Naomi hesitated. "You thought I didn't belong there," he said. "You didn't ask me anything. You just assumed." Lasky didn't answer. The silence pressed in. Naomi stood slowly, her voice low. "Captain, we all have instincts, but instincts shaped by fear instead of truth become weapons. Talia spoke next, voice unwavering. And when you hold that kind of power, your fear becomes policy, and policy becomes a fence to keep people like us out. Lasky shifted. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. His lips parted, but nothing came. Whatever defense he thought he had, it didn't survive the weight of the room. The chairwoman cleared her throat again. We'll recess briefly for deliberation. Please remain nearby. Naomi stepped out into the hallway, exhaling like she hadn't in days. The hearing wasn't over, but the tide had turned. She could feel it, not in the words said, but in the silence that followed. Jalen walked beside her, quiet at first. Then he asked, "Did I mess things up?" "By speaking?" She turned to him, caught off guard. "Mess things up? Jalen, you grounded that entire room." He blinked. "That's good?" She laughed softly. "That's powerful." Just then, her phone buzzed. A message from Nair's executive director. "Please return to the chamber. Decision ready for delivery." Back inside, the board reconvened. No pageantry, no applause. The chairwoman spoke clearly. After reviewing all presented materials and witness testimony, the board has voted. Captain Lasky will be permanently removed from duty and barred from future leadership or training roles within NAR-affiliated programs. A soft collective breath passed through the room. Talia closed her eyes. Naomi's shoulders eased. The chairwoman continued. "We also acknowledge a failure in our internal systems, specifically a lack of accountability around behavioral bias. We're launching a new initiative, Open Skies, to ensure equity training is not just recommended, but required." Jalen looked up at Naomi. She didn't say anything, just squeezed his hand. As they stepped outside, the light felt different. Not brighter exactly, just clearer. They passed reporters, flashing cameras, murmured questions. Naomi paused, turned toward the crowd. "I won't be taking questions," she said, "but I'll leave you with this. Change doesn't happen because one person shouts. It happens when others stop pretending not to hear." That night back home, Jalen stood at his bedroom window, staring up at a sky that no longer looked so far away. Planes blinked above the clouds like distant ideas coming closer. He reached for his notebook, not the old one, but a new one. The first page read, "Flight Log, Day 1. He wrote a single line beneath it. "The sky is open." The week after the hearing felt strangely quiet, not empty, but still, like a storm had finally passed and left the air thick with its memory. Naomi stood in her office at home, sunlight warming the hardwood floor beneath her bare feet. On her desk were two envelopes. One was from NAR, an official letter reinstating her full authority, "Elongvoalwa moi tham giamot, nhom kovanoi, bove kai kachingan. Kon kai kon lai, lataviet, tu mot goi kong giten." She opened that one first. "You don't know me, but I saw what you did. I've worked in this industry for 28 years, and I've never once seen someone stand up the way you did. I'm sorry it took this long. We should have had your back sooner." Naomi folded the letter slowly, a lump rising in her throat. Not because it was flattering, but because it meant she hadn't shouted into the void. Down the hallway, Jalen's bedroom door was cracked open. Inside, he was assembling a model plane. Quiet, focused, hands steady. Naomi leaned on the doorway watching him. "You need help with that wing piece?" she asked. Jalen looked up. "Nah, I got it." She nodded, letting the silence settle in again, then stepped in and sat at the edge of his bed. "Remember when you asked me if you should stop loving planes?" she said. Jalen looked confused for a second, then nodded slowly. "You didn't just keep loving them," she said. "You made space for someone else to love them too. Someone who hasn't even realized they're allowed to yet." Jalen didn't say anything. He just smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but calm, grounded, like someone who knew exactly where he was going. Later that evening, Naomi opened her email and saw something unexpected, an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Youth Conference in Dallas. The theme, Reclaiming the Skies. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then clicked Accept. 6 weeks later, Jalen stood on a stage in front of 200 students from across the country, some younger than him, many older. He wore a navy blazer that still felt a little big in the shoulders and held a folded piece of paper in his left hand. He wasn't supposed to speak, but when one of the panelists had to cancel last minute, Naomi suggested him, quietly and only if he wanted to. To her surprise, he'd said yes without hesitation. Now the mic sat in front of him like a test he didn't study for. He cleared his throat. "My name is Jalen Morrow. I'm 10. I like airplanes." A soft laugh rolled through the crowd. Jalen smiled. "But a few months ago, I almost stopped liking them. Not because they weren't cool anymore, but because someone decided I looked wrong to like them in the first place." The room quieted. "I thought maybe I didn't belong in the sky. But my mom, she said I didn't need permission to dream." He unfolded the paper and read one last line. "So now, I want to be a pilot. And one day, I'll teach kids like me to fly too." The applause wasn't thunderous. It wasn't wild. But it was warm, real, and for Jalen, it was enough. Back home, Naomi stood in the kitchen, reading a handwritten card that had arrived in the mail. "I've spent years trying to teach my daughter confidence, but your story did it in one night. Thank you for reminding us that dignity can be louder than outrage." She placed the card on the counter and looked out the window. A plane passed overhead, its shadow trailing softly over the lawn. That evening, she and Jalen sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn from gold to gray blue. He asked, "Do you think they'll still try to stop kids like me?" She considered the question carefully. "Maybe," she said, "but now they'll have to go through a few more people first." Jalen leaned his head on her shoulder, eyes following the blinking lights above. "I think next time," he whispered, "I'll be the one flying." And Naomi didn't answer, not with words, just a deep, quiet breath, the kind you take right before liftoff. Sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is stand still when the world expects them to back away. And sometimes the boldest thing a child can do is keep dreaming out loud, even when no one wants to listen. This wasn't just a story about a boy who loves planes. It was about who gets to dream and who decides who belongs where. Do you think the skies are truly open to everyone? Or are there still gates we haven't dared to unlock? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because we're just getting started, and the next story might be the one you needed to hear.